Section 10 of A Popular History of France, Volume 4. A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, Volume 4, by François Guizot. Translated by Robert Black. CHAPTER XXVIII. Francis I. and Charles V. Part 10. The two armies were of pretty equal strength; they had each from 20 to 25,000 infantry, French, Germans, Spaniards, lanzknechts, and Swiss. Francis I. had the advantage in artillery and in heavy cavalry, called at that time the gendarmerie, that is to say, the corps of men at arms in heavy armor with their servants; but his troops were inferior in effectives to the Imperialists; and Charles V.'s two generals, Bourbon and Pescara, were, as men of war, far superior to Francis I. and his favorite Bonnivet. In the night between the 23d and 24th of February, they opened a breach of 40 or 50 fathoms in the wall around the park of Mirabello, where the French camp was situated. A corps immediately passed through it, marching on Pavia to re enforce the garrison, and the main body of the imperial army entered the park to offer the French battle on that ground. The king at once set his army in motion, and his well posted artillery mowed down the corps of Germans and Spaniards who had entered the park. "You could see nothing," says a witness of the battle, "but heads and arms flying about." The action seemed to be going ill for the Imperialists. Pescara urged the Duke of Bourbon and Lannoy, the viceroy of Naples, to make haste and come up. Lannoy made the sign of the cross, and said to his men, "There is no hope but in God; follow me, and do every one as I do." Francis I., on his side, advanced with the pick of his men at arms, burst on the advance guard of the army, broke it, killed with his own hand the Marquis of Civita San Angelo, and dispersed the various corps he found in his way. In the confidence of his joy he thought the victory decided, and turning to Marshal de Foix, who was with him, "Monsieur de Lescun," said he, "now am I fain to call myself Duke of Milan." But Bourbon and Pescara were not the men to accept a defeat so soon. They united all their forces, and resumed the offensive at all points. The French batteries, masked by an ill considered movement on the part of their own troops, who threw themselves between them and the enemy, lost all serviceability; and Pescara launched upon the French gendarmerie 1,500 Basque arquebusiers, whom he had exercised and drilled to penetrate into the midst of the horses, shoot both horses and riders, and fall back rapidly after having discharged their pieces. Being attacked by the German lanzknechts of Bourbon and Freundsberg, the Swiss in the French service did not maintain their renown, and began to give way. "My God, what is all this?" cried Francis I., seeing them waver, and he dashed towards them to lead them back into action. But neither his efforts nor those of John of Diesbach or the Lord of Fleuranges, who were their commanders, were attended with success. The king was only the more eager for the fray, and, rallying around him all those of his men at arms who would neither recoil nor surrender, he charged the Imperialists furiously, throwing himself into the thickest of the melley, and seeking in excess of peril some chance of victory. But Pescara, though wounded in 3 places, was none the less stubbornly fighting on; and Antony de Leyva, governor of Pavia, came within the greater part of the garrison to his aid. At this very moment Francis I. heard that the first prince of the blood, his brother in law the Duke of Alencon, who commanded the rear guard, had precipitately left the field of battle. The oldest and most glorious warriors of France, La Tremoille, Marshal of Chabannes, Marshal de Foix, the grand equerry San Severino, the Duke of Suffolk, Francis of Lorraine, Chaumont, Bussy d'Amboise, and Francis de Duras fell, here and there, mortally wounded. At this sight Admiral Bonnivet in despair exclaimed, "I can never survive this fearful havoc;" and, raising the visor of his helmet, he rushed to meet the shots which were aimed at him, and in his turn fell beside his comrades in arms. Bourbon had expressly charged his men to search everywhere in the melley for the admiral, and bring him in a prisoner. When, as he passed along that part of the battle field, he recognized the corpse, "Ah, wretch!" he cried as he moved away, "it is thou who hast caused the ruin of France and of me." Amidst these dead and dying, Francis still fought on. Wounded as he was in the face, the arms, and the legs, he struck right and left with his huge sword, and cut down the nearest of his assailants. But his horse, mortally wounded, dragged him down as it fell. He was up again in an instant, and, standing beside his horse, he laid low 2 more Spaniards who were pressing him closely. The ruck of the soldiers crowded about him; they did not know him, but his stature, his strength, his bravery certainty of guarding him securely. Francis made no objection to this design. On the 12th of May, 1525, he wrote to his mother, "Madame, the bearer has assured me that he will bring you this letter safely; and, as I have but little time, I will tell you nothing more than I shall be off to Naples on Monday, and so keep a lookout at sea, for we shall have only 14 galleys to take us, and 1800 Spaniards to man them; but those will be all their arquebusiers. Above all, haste; for if that is made, I am in hopes that you may soon see your most humble and most obedient son." There was no opportunity for even attempting to carry off the king as he went by sea to Naples. Instead of taking him to Naples, Lannoy transported him straight to Spain, with the full assent of the king and the regent themselves, for it was in French galleys manned by Spanish troops that the voyage was made. Instead of awaiting the result of such doubtful chances of deliverance as might occur in Italy, Francis I., his mother, and his sister Margaret entertained the idea that what was of the utmost importance for him was to confer and treat in person with Charles V., which could not be done save in Spain itself. In vain did Bourbon and Pescara, whose whole influence and ambitious hopes lay in Italy, and who, on that stage, regarded Francis I. as their own prisoner rather than Charles V.'s, exert themselves to combat this proposal. The Viceroy of Naples, in concert no doubt with Charles V. himself as well as with Francis I. and his mother, took no heed of their opposition; and Francis I., disembarking at the end of June at Barcelona first, and then at Valentia, sent, on the 2d of July, to Charles V. the Duke de Montmorency, with orders to say that he had desired to approach the emperor, "not only to obtain peace and deliverance in his own person, but also to establish and confirm Italy in the state and fact of devotion to the emperor, before that the potentates and lords of Italy should have leisure to rally together in opposition." The regent, his mother, and his sister Margaret congratulated him heartily on his arrival in Spain, and Charles V. himself wrote to him, "It was a pleasure to me to hear of your arrival over here, because that just now it will be the cause of a happy general peace for the great good of Christendom, which is what I most desire." It is difficult to understand how Francis I. and Charles V. could rely upon personal interviews and negotiations for putting an end to their contentions and establishing a general peace. Each knew the other's pretensions, and they knew how little disposed they were, either of them, to abandon them. On the 28th of March, 1525, a month after the battle of Pavia, Charles V. had given his ambassadors instructions as to treating for the ransom and liberation of the King of France. His chief requirements were, that Francis I. should renounce all attempts at conquest in Italy, that he should give up the suzerainty of the countships of Flanders and Artois, that he should surrender to Charles V. the duchy of Burgundy with all its dependencies, as derived from Mary of Burgundy, daughter of the last duke, Charles the Rash, and that the Duke of Bourbon should be reinstated in possession of all his domains, with the addition thereto of Provence and Dauphiny, which should form an independent state; and, lastly, that France should pay England all the sums of money which Austria owed her. Francis I., on hearing, at Pizzighittone, these proposals read out, suddenly drew his sword as if to stab himself, saying, "It were better for a king to end thus." His custodian, Alencon, seized his arm, whilst recalling him to his senses. Francis recovered calmness, but without changing his resolution. He would rather, he said, bury himself in a prison forever than subscribe to conditions destructive of his kingdom, and such as the States General of France would never accept. When Francis I. was removed to Spain, he had made only secondary concessions as to these requirements of Charles V., and Charles V. had not abandoned any one of his original requirements. Marshal de Montmorency, when sent by the king to the emperor on the 2d of July, 1525, did not enter at all into the actual kernel of the negotiation. After some conventional protestations of a pacific kind, he confined himself to demanding "a safe conduct for Madame Marguerite of France, the king's only sister, Duchess of Alencon and Berry, who would bring with her such and so full powers of treating for peace, the liberation of the king, and friendly alliance to secure the said peace, that the emperor would clearly see that the king's intentions were pure and genuine, and that he would be glad to conclude and decide in a month what might otherwise drag on for a long while to the great detriment of their subjects." The marshal was at the same time to propose the conclusion of a truce during the course of the negotiations. Amongst the letters at that time addressed to Francis I., a prisoner of war, is the following, dated March, 1525, when he was still in Italy: My lord, the joy we are still feeling at the kind letters which you were pleased to write yesterday to me and to your mother, makes us so happy with the assurance of your health, on which our life depends, that it seems to me that we ought to think of nothing but of praising God and desiring a continuance of your good news, which is the best meat we can have to live on. And inasmuch as the Creator hath given us grace that our Trinity should be always united, the other two do entreat you that this letter, presented to you who are the third, may be accepted with the same affection with which it is cordially offered you by your most humble and most obedient servants, your mother and sister, Louise, Marguerite." This close and tender union of the three continued through all separations and all trials. The confidence of the captive king was responsive to the devotion of his mother the regent and of his sister who had become his negotiatrix. When the news came of the king's captivity, the regency threatened for a moment to become difficult and stormy. All the ambition and the hatred that lay dormant in the court awoke. An attempt was made to excite in the Duke of Vendome, the head of the younger branch of the house of Bourbon, a desire to take the regent's place. The Parliament of Paris attacked the chancellor, Duprat, whom they hated, not without cause. But the Duke of Vendome was proof against the attempts which were made upon him, and frankly supported the regent, who made him the chief of her council; and the regent supported the chancellor. She displayed, in these court contentions, an ability partaking both of firmness and pliancy. The difficulties of foreign policy found her equally active and prudent. The greatest peril which France could at that time incur arose from the maintenance of the union between the King of England and Charles V. At the first news of the battle of Pavia, Henry VIII. Dreamed for a moment of the partition of France between Charles and himself, with the crown of France for his own share. Demonstrations of joy took place at the court of London, and attempts were made to levy, without the concurrence of Parliament, imposts capable of sufficing for such an enterprise. But the English nation felt no inclination to put up with this burden and the king's arbitrary power in order to begin over again the 100 Years' War. The primate, Warham, Archbishop of Canterbury, wrote to Cardinal Wolsey, "It is reported to me that when the people had orders to make bonfires for the capture of the King of France, many folk said that it was more reason for weeping than for rejoicing. Others openly expressed their desire that the King of France might be set at liberty, that a happy peace might be concluded, and that the king might not attempt to conquer France again, a conquest more burdensome than profitable, and more difficult to keep than to make." Wolsey himself was cooled towards Charles V., who, instead of writing to him as of old, and signing with his own hand, "Your son and cousin," now merely put his name, Charles. The regent, Louise of Savoy, profited ably by these feelings and circumstances in England. A negotiation was opened between the two courts. Henry VIII. Gained by it 2 millions of crowns payable by annual instalments of 50,000 crowns each, and Wolsey received a pension of 100,000 crowns. At first a truce for 4 months, and then an alliance, offensive and defensive, were concluded on the 30th of August, 1525, between France and England, and the regent, Louise of Savoy, had no longer to trouble herself about anything except the captivity of the king her son, and the departure of her daughter Margaret to go and negotiate for the liberation of the prisoner. Section 11.